Sarah Rodriguez's stomach dropped as she watched her own mother, wearing a cleaner's uniform, freeze at the sight of her ICE badge. Years of carefully maintained lies crumbling in the sterile corporate hallway. Sarah Rodriguez stood at attention in the gleaming lobby of TechVision Enterprises, her polished badge catching the morning light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Around her, a tactical team of immigration and customs enforcement agents moved with practiced precision, their presence sending ripples of unease through the early morning office crowd. "Remember, we're looking for undocumented workers in the maintenance crew," Agent Mike Thompson briefed the team, his voice low and steady. "Building security has confirmed they're all here for the morning shift." Sarah nodded, suppressing the familiar twist of discomfort these operations always brought. At 28, she was the youngest agent on the team and the only Latina. Her recent promotion still felt like a fresh badge of honor, even if it came with sideways glances from some colleagues who wondered if it was mere tokenism. The morning sun painted Los Angeles in shades of gold, but inside the corporate tower, fluorescent lights cast their harsh glow on marble floors and chrome fixtures. Sarah caught her reflection in a mirrored wall, crisp blue uniform, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that carried the determined look she'd practiced since academy days. "Agent Rodriguez, take the East Wing, floors 20 through 25. Thompson directed. "Chun's cleaning service has most of their people concentrated there." The elevator ride up was a quiet affair, filled with the soft hum of machinery and the weight of what was to come. Sarah had done dozens of these operations, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the anonymous tip that had seemed unusually specific. Or perhaps it was the dream she'd had last night about her mother, the one where they were back in their old apartment. Carmen singing softly in Spanish while folding laundry. The 23rd floor was eerily quiet when she stepped out. The scent of industrial cleaner hung in the air, mixing with the artificial pine freshener that seemed universal to all office buildings. A cleaning cart stood abandoned near the water cooler, its supplies scattered as if left in a hurry. Sarah moved methodically through the space, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The first few offices yielded nothing, but she could hear movement further down the hall. The soft squeak of rubber solids on freshly mopped floors, the clinking of cleaning supplies. She rounded the corner and froze. Time seemed to stop, crystallizing into a single terrible moment of recognition. There, not 20 feet away, stood Carmen Rodriguez, her mother, wearing the green uniform of Chun's cleaning service, a spray bottle clutched in her suddenly trembling hand. The world tilted on its axis. Sarah's throat constricted as she watched the color drain from her mother's face, the spray bottle slipping from nerveless fingers to clatter against the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent hallway. "Mama?" The word escaped before Sarah could stop it, small and broken like a child's plea. Carmen's eyes, so like her own, widened with a mixture of terror and resignation. 20 years of lies and unspoken truths collapsed into this single moment of devastating clarity. Behind Sarah, the elevator chimed. Agent Thompson's voice crackled over her radio. "Rodriguez, status report?" The badge on her chest had never felt heavier. She stared at her mother, seeing not just a woman who had raised her single-handedly, but now also the subject of an active immigration investigation. The same mother who had somehow paid for her college education, who had pushed her to pursue her dreams, who had been so proud when she joined law enforcement. The bitter irony threatened to choke her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah's training kicked in, forcing her features into a mask of professional detachment, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. 20 feet had never felt like such an impossible distance. "Please step away from your supplies and present identification," she heard herself say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Her mother's hands trembled as she reached for the lanyard around her neck, a fake ID. Sarah realized with a sickening lurch How many times had she seen this same scene play out with other suspects? The radio crackled again. "Rodriguez, do you copy?" She unclipped it with mechanical precision. "Floor 23 secure. One subject detained. Stand by." The formal language created a buffer, however thin, between her role and her reality. Carmen hadn't moved, her eyes fixed on Sarah's badge. 20 years of memories cascaded through Sarah's mind. Her mother's hands, always raw from cleaning chemicals, braiding her hair for school, the proud smile at her academy graduation, the weekly Sunday calls that had grown shorter and more stilted as Sarah climbed the ranks at ICE. "Agent Thompson is approaching from the south stairwell," dispatch informed her. The words galvanized Carmen into action. "Mija," she whispered, taking a half step forward. "I can explain. Don't move," Sarah commanded, her voice sharp with panic. She couldn't let her mother say anything incriminating, not with building security cameras recording every moment. "Remain where you are and keep your hands visible." Footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Sarah's mind raced. In less than a minute, her partner would round that corner and her world would shatter completely. Thompson was a good agent. Fair, but by the book. He'd been her mentor since she joined the force, had recommended her for promotion. He also had no tolerance for agents who compromised operations. Carmen seemed to shrink into herself, becoming smaller, older. The proud woman who had raised Sarah single-handedly was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by just another frightened, undocumented worker. How many similar transformations had Sarah witnessed without truly seeing them? "The night shift supervisor's office," Sarah said quietly, rapidly. "Second door on your right. Go. Now." Her mother hesitated for a fraction of a second, then moved. The door had barely clicked shut when Thompson appeared, his practiced eye taking in the scattered cleaning supplies. Subject fled through the emergency stairs. Sarah reported crisply, pointing to the exit at the far end of the corridor. "Female, mid-40s, green uniform. I was about to pursue when you arrived." Thompson nodded, already reaching for his radio. "All units, possible runner heading down the east stairwell. Rodriguez, stay and secure this floor. Chen's supervisor should be arriving soon for questioning." Sarah maintained her professional posture until Thompson disappeared into the stairwell. Then she sagged against the wall, her legs threatening to give way. Through the thin office walls, she could hear her mother's muffled breathing. The next hour passed in a blur of procedure. William Chun arrived, impeccably dressed and concerned, his eyes darting between Sarah and the cleaning supplies still scattered across the floor. He answered questions with careful precision, provided employment records that Sarah knew must be falsified. She watched him through new eyes, wondering how many other family secrets he kept. "Agent Rodriguez has been one of our most effective investigators," Thompson was saying to Chun. "Her background gives her unique insights into these situations." The words hit her like physical blows. How many times had she used her heritage to gain trust, to make frightened workers feel safe enough to incriminate themselves? How many families had she helped tear apart while building her own career? When the operation finally wound down, 3 undocumented workers had been detained from other floors. Sarah volunteered to process the paperwork, buying precious time. As the last agents departed, she returned to the night supervisor's office, her steps leaden. Carmen sat exactly where Sarah had left her, perched on the edge of a cheap office chair. In the harsh fluorescent light, the silver in her hair seemed more pronounced, the lines around her eyes deeper. They stared at each other across a gulf of unspoken truths. "How long?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since before you started college," Carmen replied. "The scholarships, they weren't enough. And I wanted so much for you to have opportunities I never had." Sarah thought of her apartment in Silver Lake. Her career achievements, all built on a foundation of her mother's silent sacrifice and deception. "Why didn't you tell me?" Would it have changed your choice to join ICE? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Sarah remembered her fierce pride in being selected for the agency, her determination to prove that enforcement and compassion were mutually exclusive. She'd told herself she was making a difference from within the system. "We need to talk," she said finally, "but not here. Do you still have the key to my old apartment?" Carmen nodded, understanding passing between them. The apartment Sarah had insisted on keeping for investment purposes would become their sanctuary for the conversation that would change everything. As they prepared to leave separately, Carmen paused at the door. "I've always been proud of you, Mia. That hasn't changed." Sarah watched her mother slip away, blending seamlessly into the morning cleaning crew exodus. She touched her badge, feeling its weight anew. In less than an hour, she had become both enforcer and accomplice, protector and betrayer. The neat categories that had defined her career had crumbled, leaving her in uncharted territory. Her phone buzzed, a text from Thompson praising her quick thinking during the operation. Sarah stared at the message until the screen went dark, reflecting her own troubled expression. The sun had fully risen over Los Angeles now, painting the city in unforgiving clarity. Sarah knew that after today, nothing would ever look quite the same again. The drive to Sarah's old apartment in Echo Park felt like navigating through a dream. Every traffic light, every turn was familiar, yet somehow foreign, like looking at a childhood photo and barely recognizing yourself. She parked her unmarked vehicle 2 blocks away. Standard procedure turned survival tactic. The small complex hadn't changed. Same cracking stucco, same bougainvillea spilling over the courtyard wall. Sarah had chosen this place fresh out of the academy, drawn to its proximity to her first posting. Now she wondered if her mother had been watching over her even then, one of the invisible army that kept Edel's buildings clean while its occupants slept. Carmen was already inside when Sarah entered. The apartment smelled of lemon pledge and coffee, her mother's signature combination. Some habits ran too deep to break, even in crisis. "I made café con leche," Carmen said softly, holding out a mug like a peace offering. Like before, Sarah accepted it mechanically, noting how her mother had already cleaned the dusty kitchen counter. The mundane domesticity of the moment felt surreal against the morning's events. How many others? Sarah asked, her investigator's instinct surfacing despite herself. At TechVision? Carmen's shoulders tensed. "Mia, don't ask me. I need to know, Mama. I need to understand everything." Sarah's voice cracked. "Do you realize what could have happened today? What still might happen?" 12. Carmen answered finally. "Most with families. Maria Gutierrez, her husband was deported last year. She has 3 children, all citizens. Isabella Mendoza is putting 2 kids through college." She paused. "We take care of each other." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the names and stories washing over her. Each one represented a potential case, a file on her desk, a family she might have been responsible for separating. Does William Chun know? He knows enough. He pays fair wages, provides real benefits. Many owners. Carmen's expression darkened. They are not so good. The coffee grew cold as Carmen detailed a shadow economy Sarah had glimpsed but never truly understood. A network of mutual support, of shared information about which companies treated workers humanely, which managers could be trusted. The invisible infrastructure that kept America's offices gleaming while its policies tried to wish away the people who did the work. "Your college fund," Carmen continued, each word heavy with confession. "Part was from cleaning, yes. But I also," she hesitated, "I coordinate the schedules, help place new workers. Chun pays extra for this." Sarah's trained mind automatically cataloged the implications. Conspiracy, trafficking allegations, RICO possibilities. She forced the thoughts away, bile rising in her throat. "When I joined ICE," she said carefully, "I thought I could make things better from the inside. help create a more humane system. A bitter laugh escaped her. Instead, I've been terrorizing people like you, like Maria and Isabella. You were following your dream, Carmen insisted. I wanted that for you. To reach higher, to not spend your life on your knees scrubbing other people's floors. At what cost, Mama? The risks you've taken. Sarah's voice caught. If Thompson had found you instead of me, the possibility hung between them like a guillotine blade. Sarah knew the detention center protocols intimately, had enforced them countless times. The overcrowded cells, the separated families, the coldly efficient deportation machinery. Her phone buzzed. A message from Thompson about a follow-up raid planned for next week. Another cleaning service, another building. How many more mothers would be torn from their children? How many more families shattered in the name of law and order? Carmen watched her daughter's face, reading the conflict there. What will you do now? It was the question Sarah had been avoiding since that morning's recognition. Her career, her achievements, her identity as an agent, everything balanced against her mother's freedom, against the human cost of the system she served. I need to make a phone call, she said finally, pulling out her personal cell phone rather than her work device. Her fingers hovered over the keypad before dialing a number she'd kept but never used. Legal Aid Center. This is Maya speaking. Sarah took a deep breath. My name is Sarah Rodriguez. I'm an ICE agent, and I need to talk to someone about whistleblower protections. Carmen's sharp intake of breath made Sarah reach for her mother's hand. Their fingers intertwined, bridge and barrier both. I also, Sarah continued, her voice strengthening, need to discuss options for adjusting the status of an undocumented worker with over 20 years of residence and an American citizen child. As she listened to Maya's response, Sarah watched the morning light paint patterns on her mother's face. The same face that had smiled over her homework, had beamed at her graduation, had masked its fears behind maternal pride for so many years. The choice she was making would end her career at ICE. Everything she'd worked for would be sacrificed. But looking at her mother, Sarah realized some sacrifices were really reclamations in disguise. Maya's measured legal advice filled Sarah's apartment as shadows lengthened across the floor. Words like protected disclosure and material evidence mixed with family reunification and humanitarian considerations. Sarah took careful notes. Her investigator's training now turned toward dismantling the very system she had served. There's something else you should know, Carmen said after Sarah ended the call. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. The anonymous tip about tech vision. It wasn't random. Sarah's professional instincts snapped to attention. What do you mean? There's a new manager in the building. He demanded extra services from some of the women. When they refused, Carmen's face hardened. He threatened to call immigration. So he called first. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been part of dozens of raids initiated by anonymous tips, never questioning the complex web of power and vulnerability behind them. How many other cases had similar stories lurking beneath the surface? Names, she said, pulling out her notebook. Dates, details, everything you can remember. Her hand was steady as she wrote. Years of training channeled into a new purpose. If we're going to do this, we do it right. As Carmen spoke, a pattern emerged. Exploitation, harassment, threats of deportation used as leverage. Sarah recognized some of the buildings, the companies, places where her team had conducted raids, never seeing the full picture. Her phone buzzed again. Thompson. She let it go to voicemail, knowing each ignored call pushed her further past the point of no return. The sun was setting over Los Angeles when Carmen finally fell silent, their devastating dossier complete. What happens now? Carmen asked, looking smaller in the growing darkness. Sarah stood, switching on lamps, creating pools of warm light against the gathering shadows. Now we get ahead of this. I'm going to reach out to some people. Journalists I trust, advocates I've met during investigations. But first, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I need you to warn the others. Maria, Isabella, anyone who might be targeted in follow-up raids. They won't trust a message coming from an ICE agent, Carmen pointed out. No, Sarah agreed. That they'll trust their friend Carmen, who's kept them safe all these years. The pride in her mother's eyes made Sarah's throat tight. How had she never seen this strength before? This quiet leadership that had protected and guided so many. They worked through the night, Carmen making calls in rapid-fire Spanish while Sarah compiled evidence, cross-referencing cases, building an irrefutable narrative of systemic abuse. Every so often, her work phone would buzz with increasingly urgent messages from ICE. Questions about her absence, demands for reports, concerns about her erratic behavior during the morning's operation. Dawn was breaking when Sarah finally looked up from her notes. Carmen had fallen asleep on the couch, her face peaceful despite everything. Moving quietly, Sarah covered her with a blanket, remembering all the times her mother had done the same for her. Her personal phone vibrated. Maya from Legal Aid. Are you ready? The lawyer asked without preamble. Once we file these whistleblower documents, there's no going back. Sarah looked at her badge, laid out on the kitchen table like a confession. I'm ready, but we need to move fast. There's a follow-up raid planned for next week. Our team is standing by. And Sarah, you're doing the right thing. The words should have been comforting, but they landed like lead in her stomach. The right thing would cost her career, her colleagues' trust, possibly even her freedom if the department decided to make an example of her. Yet looking at her sleeping mother, Sarah knew she would choose this path again without hesitation. Her work phone lit up with another message from Thompson. Whatever's going on, we can fix this. Don't throw away everything you've built. Sarah typed out a response, then deleted it. How could she explain that she wasn't throwing anything away, but rather finding something that had been lost? That every arrest, every raid, every family separated had been steps leading her here, to this moment of clarity? Outside, Los Angeles was stirring to life. Soon, invisible armies of cleaners would begin their daily retreat, making way for the office workers who would never know their names. But today would be different. Today, Sarah Rodriguez would make them seen. The next 48 hours unfolded like a tactical operation, one Sarah had trained for, but never quite like this. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by documents, while Maya coordinated with a coalition of civil rights attorneys. Carmen had reluctantly returned to her own apartment, armed with burner phones and emergency contacts. Sarah's resignation letter sat unsent in her email drafts, a detonator waiting to be triggered. The timing had to be perfect. Whistleblower documents filed, press briefed, evidence secured. One wrong move and the entire house of cards would collapse. Her work phone had fallen silent after Thompson's last message. Meeting with Internal Affairs tomorrow. Your presence required. The formal language couldn't mask his sense of betrayal. Sarah allowed herself a moment of grief for their friendship, another casualty of the coming storm. A knock at the door made her freeze. Through the peephole, she saw William Chen, impeccable as always in his tailored suit. I know you're in there, Agent Rodriguez, he called softly. We need to talk. Sarah's hand hovered over her service weapon. Old habits died hard. But when she opened the door, Chun's face held only tired resignation. Your mother called me, he said, stepping inside. She thought I should know what's coming. Sarah studied him, seeing not the polished businessman from interrogations, but someone carrying his own weight of impossible choices. How long have you been helping them? Since my own mother was deported. Chun's professional facade cracked slightly. I was in college. No one would hire her because of her accent, her age. But she could clean. Like your mother, she wanted better for her children. He placed a leather portfolio on her table. Employment records. Pay stubs. Documentation of every complaint about harassment, every threat of deportation used as leverage. 20 years of evidence. Sarah's investigator's mind raced through the implications. This could shut down your business. You could face charges. Some things are worth the risk. Chum straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that made him seem suddenly human. Your mother has protected our people for years. Perhaps it's time we returned the favor. As he left, Sarah added his documents to her growing arsenal. The pattern was undeniable now. Systematic exploitation, harassment enabled by immigration policy, a corrupt ecosystem built on fear and silence. Her personal phone buzzed. A text from Carmen. Maria's daughter in hospital. Immigration checking papers at entrance. Sarah was moving before she finished reading, muscle memory taking over. She called Maya while gathering her credentials. We need to accelerate the timeline. They're starting hospital checks. The documents aren't ready. They're targeting families at their most vulnerable. Sarah cut in. We move now. She rushed to her car, mind racing through protocols and procedures, not to enforce them this time, but to subvert them. How many times had she used hospital visits to trap undocumented residents? The thought made her sick now. At the hospital, she found Maria pacing outside the emergency room, terror etched on her face. Her daughter's appendix had burst. A routine emergency turned life-altering threat by immigration status. Sarah approached slowly, seeing herself through Maria's eyes. The uniform, the badge, everything that represented fear. I'm Carmen's daughter, she said in Spanish. I'm here to help. The flash of recognition in Maria's eyes was followed by confusion, then desperate hope. Sarah led her through the hospital's service entrance, using her badge to wave off questions. Within minutes, Maria was at her daughter's bedside, clutching her hand as doctors prepared for surgery. Watching through the window, Sarah made her decision. She pulled out her phone and sent 2 emails, her resignation letter to ICE and the whistleblower documents to Maya. The response was immediate. Her work phone exploded with notifications. Internal Affairs, Thompson, her supervisor. She turned it off without reading them. There would be time for consequences later. Agent Rodriguez? She turned to find Dr. Park, a familiar face from previous hospital investigations, watching her thoughtfully. Not anymore, she replied. He nodded, understanding. There are 3 more families in the pediatric ward, afraid to seek treatment. Perhaps you can help them too? Sarah looked at Maria, now speaking softly to her sedated daughter, then back at Dr. Park. Show me. By midnight, the hospital's quiet corridors had become an impromptu command center. Dr. Park coordinated with sympathetic staff while Sarah used her knowledge of ICE procedures to keep families one step ahead of inspections. Each small victory felt like reclaiming a piece of her soul. Her phone lit up with a message from Maya. Documents filed. Press conference tomorrow. Are you ready to go public? Sarah watched a young mother cradle her sick infant, no longer hiding in the shadows. More than ready. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the steps of the Federal Building, a location Sarah had entered countless times with pride, but now approached with trepidation. Maya had assembled a coalition of civil rights attorneys, immigrant advocacy groups, and investigative journalists. The morning air crackled with anticipation. Sarah adjusted her blazer, conscious of how different she felt out of uniform. Her testimony had been carefully prepared. Each word weighted for maximum impact without compromising ongoing investigations or individual privacy. Chum's documents lay in her briefcase like a time bomb. You don't have to do this, Carmen said beside her, gripping her hand. They had argued about her mother's presence, but Carmen had been adamant. I won't hide while you risk everything. Before Sarah could respond, she spotted Thompson walking through the gathering crowd. Her heart stuttered. He wasn't due at the Internal Affairs meeting for another hour. Their eyes met across the plaza. and for a moment, she saw past his professional mask to the mentor who had guided her career. He reached them just as the first news vans arrived. 5 minutes, he said quietly. Away from the cameras. Sarah hesitated, but Carmen squeezed her hand. Go. Some bridges shouldn't burn completely. They found a quiet corner behind the courthouse pillars. Thompson looked older than Sarah remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. You could have come to me, he said finally. We could have handled this internally. Like all the other internal investigations, Sarah kept her voice level. How many complaints have been buried? How many victims stayed silent because they feared deportation more than they feared their abusers? The system isn't perfect, but the system is the problem. Sarah cut in. And I was part of it. Every time we used immigration status as leverage, every time we ignored exploitation because it made our jobs easier. She took a breath. I can't do it anymore, Mike. Thompson studied her face, the same scrutiny he'd taught her to use during interrogations. Your mother, he said finally. Was she there during the TechVision raid? Sarah met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying. After a long moment, Thompson nodded. Be careful, Rodriguez. Once you cross this line, there's no coming back. I crossed that line the moment. I chose justice over protocol. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I taught you too well. He turned to leave, then paused. That follow-up raid next week, it's been postponed indefinitely. Operational security concerns. The implied message was clear. A small mercy from a man struggling with his own conscience. Sarah watched him disappear into the crowd. Another bridge transformed, but not quite burned. Maya found her moments later. We're ready, Doctor. Park brought some of the families from the hospital. Their testimonies will support your statement. She handed Sarah a folder. These just came in from other ICE agents. Apparently, you're not the only one with concerns. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read. Detailed accounts from fellow agents, each one a thread in the tapestry of systemic abuse she was about to expose. Some she recognized by their badge numbers, others remained anonymous, but all shared the same awakening she had experienced. The press conference began with Maya outlining the legal framework of their case. Sarah watched the reporters. Expressions shift from professional interest to genuine shock as the pattern of exploitation emerged. When it was her turn to speak, she felt strangely calm. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Until yesterday, I was a senior agent with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Today, I am here to tell you about a system that doesn't just fail to protect the vulnerable. It actively enables their exploitation. As she spoke, she saw her mother in the audience, standing proudly beside Maria and other workers from TechVision. Chen was there too, his presence a silent testament to the complexity of their shared story. Even some of her former ICE colleagues lingered at the edges of the crowd, their expressions unreadable. This isn't about individual bad actors, she continued, her training giving weight to each word. This is about a system that turns immigration status into a weapon, that forces people to choose between deportation and abuse, that tears families apart in the name of law and order. The evidence was undeniable. Chun's records, hospital reports, agent testimonies, worker statements. Each document added another crack to the facade of institutional integrity. Sarah watched understanding dawn in the reporter's eyes. This wasn't just another scandal, but a fundamental challenge to the system itself. The aftermath of the press conference exploded across Los Angeles like a shockwave. By sunset, Sarah's face was on every major news network, her testimony dissected by pundits and politicians. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other ICE agents, some supportive, others accusatory, all struggling to process the implications of her revelations. She sat in Maya's office, watching the coverage while their legal team worked to stay ahead of the department's response. Internal Affairs had already announced an investigation, though whether it would target the abuses or the whistleblowers remained to be seen. "They've frozen your accounts," Maya reported, hanging up her phone. "Standard retaliation protocol." "We expected this," Sarah nodded, remembering how many times she'd been part of similar procedures. "What about the workers?" "Maria, Isabella, the others. Safe for now. The publicity makes it difficult for ICE to move against them directly." Maya paused. "But Chun's company is under investigation. They'll try to frame this as an isolated case of corporate misconduct." "It's never isolated," Sarah murmured, thinking of the patterns she'd seen throughout her career. Her desk at ICE held years of similar cases, each one filed away as a separate incident rather than part of a systemic problem. Her mother called as night fell. "The night shift supervisor at TechVision quit," Carmen reported. "He said he couldn't sleep, knowing what was happening. More are coming forward." The dominoes were falling, but Sarah knew the real battle was just beginning. Her testimony had cracked the foundation, but institutions like ICE had deep roots and powerful defenders. A text from Thompson appeared. "Meeting with brass tomorrow. They're scared, Rodriguez. Keep pushing." She was drafting a response when Maya burst in, waving a tablet. "You need to see this." The screen showed security footage from a downtown office building, similar to TechVision, but different. A manager cornering a cleaning woman in an empty office. His intentions clear. The timestamp was from just 2 days ago. "It's happening everywhere," Sarah breathed, her investigator's mind already cataloging details. "This isn't just about immigration anymore." "No," Maya agreed grimly. "It's about power. Immigration status is just the leverage they use to maintain it." More footage arrived throughout the night. Whistleblowers emboldened by Sarah's testimony, sharing evidence they'd been too afraid to reveal before. Each video, each testimony, each documented threat added another layer to their case. Sarah worked through the night, her training now serving a different purpose. She mapped connections between companies, identified patterns of behavior, tracked the flow of money and influence. The picture that emerged was darker than even she had suspected. Dawn found her standing at her apartment window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, invisible armies of cleaners were finishing their shifts, heading home to sleep while Los Angeles stirred to life. But something had shifted. The shadows they lived in had been illuminated, their stories finally being heard. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Agent Rodriguez? The voice was familiar, one of the internal affairs investigators she'd worked with before. Off the record. "We've been sitting on similar cases for years. Orders from above to minimize documentation. Classify complaints as isolated incidents. I need everything you have," Sarah said, already reaching for her notebook. "Names, dates, pattern analysis. Check your encrypted email. And Rodriguez? Watch your back. You're not the only one they're afraid of anymore." The information arrived in bursts throughout the morning. Internal memos, suppressed complaints, evidence of systematic cover-ups. Sarah's small apartment became a command center, with Maya's legal team coordinating responses while advocacy groups organized worker protection networks. Carmen arrived with coffee and pan dulce, her presence a steady anchor amid the chaos. "Maria's daughter is being discharged today," she reported. The hospital staff, they're different now, more protective. Sarah looked at her mother, really looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had raised her, but a leader who had been fighting this battle long before Sarah understood there was a war. "How did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "All those years, keeping everyone safe, building networks, finding trustworthy allies." Carmen's smile held decades of hard-won wisdom. "The same way you're doing it now, Mia. One person at a time, one truth at a time, until the light gets in." The following week unfolded like a carefully orchestrated campaign, one that Sarah couldn't control but could help shape. Her testimony had opened floodgates across the country, with similar patterns of abuse and exploitation emerging in cities from Miami to Seattle. Maya's office had become their war room, walls covered with flowcharts connecting cleaning companies, building managers, and immigration enforcement actions. Each new piece of evidence revealed deeper layers of institutional complicity. "Boston just broke," Maya announced, rushing in with her tablet. An ICE agent there went public with 5 years of documented cases. They're calling it the Rodriguez effect. Sarah looked up from her analysis of Chun's records, feeling the weight of her unexpected role as a catalyst. The term made her uncomfortable. This wasn't about her, but about the countless invisible workers who had suffered in silence. Her encrypted email pinged with another message from Internal Affairs. Director called emergency meeting. Your testimony cited 47 times. They're scrambling. Thompson had been sending regular updates, each one more revealing than the last. The department was fracturing, younger agents increasingly vocal about reform, veterans divided between defending the system and acknowledging its flaws. "We have a problem," Carmen interrupted, entering with her own network of informants. Reports. "Some companies are firing entire cleaning crews. They're claiming restructuring, but they're trying to eliminate witnesses." Sarah finished, her investigator's instincts flaring. "We need to get ahead of this." "Maya, can we file for emergency injunctions?" "Already on it." "But there's something else." Maya hesitated. "ICE isn't just investigating Chun's company anymore. They're looking into every business connection, every contract, including my mother's role as coordinator," Sarah said quietly. The fear she'd been suppressing rose like bile. "They're trying to build a trafficking case." The room fell silent. They all knew the strategy. She'd used it herself during investigations. Build a case against key organizers, pressure them to turn on others, watch the network unravel. Carmen stood straighter, her dignity a shield. "Let them try. Every worker I helped place, every family I protected, they know the truth." Sarah's phone lit up with a text from Dr. Park. Hospital board meeting leaked. They're discussing new ID requirements for all service contractors. The retaliation was spreading, becoming more sophisticated. Sarah could almost admire the strategy. Attack the support systems, isolate the vulnerable, restore the old power dynamics. But something had changed. The shadows weren't so dark anymore, and those who lived in them weren't alone. "We need to shift tactics," Sarah announced, her training asserting itself. They want to make this about individual cases, isolated incidents. "We show the whole pattern, not just exploitation, but the systematic response to silence whistleblowers." Maya nodded, already typing. "I'll contact the other legal teams. Coordinate our responses. The workers need to be ready too," Carmen added. "Not just to testify, but to support each other. When they fire one crew, others document. When they threaten one family, all respond." Sarah watched her mother take charge, organizing communication networks with the efficiency of a field commander. How had she never recognized this strength before? How many other skills and stories had remained hidden in the shadows of immigration status? The day stretched into evening, then night. Reports kept flowing in. More testimony from agents, more evidence from workers, more attempts at institutional pushback. Sarah worked through it all, her investigator's training now serving a different kind of justice. A message from Thompson broke her concentration. "Meeting tomorrow with Oversight Committee. They're considering federal investigation. Your documentation methods made the difference. You always did keep the best records." Sarah allowed herself a small smile, remembering his endless lectures about proper documentation. He had taught her to build airtight cases, never imagining she would use those skills to expose the very system they served. Her phone buzzed again. Dr. Park. Emergency room staff refusing to comply with new ID protocols. citing medical ethics. "You started something, Agent Rodriguez." "Not agent anymore," she texted back. "Just Sarah now." "No," he replied. "You're something more important. You're proof that change is possible." The Oversight Committee hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday, exactly 2 weeks after Sarah's initial press conference. The morning dawned clear and cold, Los Angeles shrugging off its usual marine layer to reveal sharp-edged shadows and unforgiving light. Sarah dressed carefully in a charcoal suit, not her ICE uniform, but professional enough to command respect. Her testimony would be broadcast nationally, her words scrutinized by both supporters and opponents of immigration reform. "Your evidence files," Maya said, handing her a thick folder. "Everything cross-referenced, every pattern documented." Thompson's team verified the internal records last night. The mention of Thompson made Sarah pause. Her former mentor had been called to testify after her, a scheduling choice that felt heavy with significance. Would he defend the system they both served or acknowledge the rot they'd both seen? Carmen helped her with her blazer, smoothing invisible wrinkles. "Remember when you used to dress me for school events?" Sarah asked, trying to lighten the moment. "You were always so proud of your perfect attendance certificates." Carmen smiled, then grew serious. "Today is different. Today, you're not just attending, you're changing history." They arrived at the courthouse early, but crowds had already gathered. Sarah recognized faces from TechVision, from the hospital, from other cleaning crews across the city. Mixed among them were ICE agents, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, their presence a silent statement. Inside, the hearing room hummed with tension. Committee members shuffled papers, aides whispered urgently, cameras adjusted their angles. Sarah felt the weight of all those lenses, all those expectations. The committee calls Sarah Rodriguez. Walking to the witness table, Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces. Doctor, Park in the second row, Chun sitting stiffly near the back, Thompson waiting in the witness anteroom. Her mother sat with Maria and Isabella, their presence a reminder of why she was here. "Please state your name and former position for the record." Sarah leaned into the microphone, her voice steady. "Sarah Rodriguez, former senior agent, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Los Angeles Division." The questioning began methodically, her background, her career, her reasons for coming forward. Sarah answered with precision, using her investigator's training to build an undeniable narrative. "Would you describe the pattern of exploitation you discovered?" Sarah opened her files, though she hardly needed them. The pattern typically began with identification of vulnerable workers, those whose immigration status could be leveraged. Building managers or supervisors would make inappropriate demands, knowing complaints wouldn't be filed. If workers resisted, threats of immigration raids followed. And ICE's role in this pattern? We were used as the enforcement arm, often unknowingly. Anonymous tips would trigger raids, but we never investigated the sources of those tips. Our presence became a tool of control. The questions grew sharper, more pointed. Committee members pressed for details, challenged her interpretations, sought weaknesses in her testimony. Sarah held firm, responding with documented evidence rather than emotion. "Your own mother was an undocumented worker," one congressman noted. Couldn't this be seen as a personal vendetta rather than a systemic issue? Sarah had expected this angle. "My mother's status opened my eyes, but the evidence speaks for itself. I've provided documentation of similar patterns in 27 major cities. This isn't about one family or one company. It's about a system that enables and perpetuates exploitation." Hours passed. Sarah's throat grew dry, but her resolve strengthened. With each question, she built upon her initial testimony, weaving individual stories into an undeniable pattern of institutional failure. During a brief recess, she caught Thompson's eye. He gave her a slight nod, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. They both knew the system they'd served was forever changed. Maya touched her arm. They're calling for an expansion of the investigation. Your testimony. It's working. Single quotes. Sarah watched the committee members huddled in urgent discussion. She thought of all the raids she'd led, all the families she'd helped separate, all the time she'd been part of the very system she was now exposing. It's not enough to just expose the problem, she said quietly. We need to change the entire approach to immigration enforcement. Otherwise, we're just reshuffling the shadows. The committee's final session stretched into early evening, the setting sun casting long shadows through the courthouse windows. Sarah's testimony had sparked a cascade of revelations, with other witnesses coming forward to corroborate and expand upon her evidence. Thompson's testimony proved pivotal. Rather than defending the system, he methodically detailed years of institutional blind spots and missed opportunities for reform. Agent Rodriguez, he concluded, looking directly at Sarah, didn't break the system. She simply showed us what was already broken. The committee's preliminary findings were released as night fell over Los Angeles. Recommendations for comprehensive investigation, policy reform, and immediate protective measures for vulnerable workers. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a beginning. Outside the courthouse, Sarah found herself surrounded by a mix of journalists, activists, and workers. Carmen stood slightly apart, watching her daughter with quiet pride. What happens next? A reporter called out. Sarah considered the question carefully. Next, we build something better. Not just new policies, but new understanding. We need to recognize that immigration enforcement can't be separated from human rights, from worker protection, from basic dignity. Maya appeared with updates from other cities, similar hearings being scheduled, investigations launched, networks of support forming. The Rodriguez effect had become a movement, spreading beyond immigration to touch on labor rights, healthcare access, systemic exploitation. Chun called, Carmen reported later, as they sat in Sarah's apartment, unwinding from the intensity of the day. The company board wants to create a worker advocacy program. They're asking for our help to design it. Sarah smiled at the irony. Her mother, the undocumented cleaner, being asked to help reshape corporate policy. Will you do it? We will do it, Carmen corrected. Your investigation skills, my knowledge of the workers' needs. Together, we can make real change, Doctor. Park's message arrived near midnight. The hospital had formally adopted new policies protecting patient privacy, regardless of immigration status. Other hospitals were following suit. Small victories, accumulating into larger change. Sarah stood at her window, watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, the night shift was starting. Cleaners, guards, maintenance workers emerging into their parallel world. But the shadows were different now, less able to hide exploitation, more likely to shelter solidarity. Thompson's lost words to her echoed in her mind. You taught me something too, Rodriguez. Sometimes protecting the law means changing it. Her phone buzzed with messages from other ICE agents seeking guidance. Workers needing support, advocates coordinating responses. The work ahead was enormous, but she was no longer alone in it. Carmen joined her at the window, their reflections overlapping in the glass. I used to watch you leave for work, she said softly, proud of your uniform but afraid of what it meant. Now I watch you and feel only pride. Sarah thought of her badge, still sitting in its box. She had thought turning it in would feel like losing part of her identity. Instead, it felt like finding a larger purpose. We should get some rest, she said finally. Tomorrow we'll be busy. Tomorrow will be better, Carmen corrected, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime working toward dawn. As they prepared for bed, Sarah's phone lit up one last time, a message from Maria. My daughter asked what I do for work today. For the first time, I told her the truth. She said she was proud of me. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the truths now emerging into light, all the pride being reclaimed, all the dignity being restored. The system wasn't fixed, might never be fully fixed, but it could no longer operate unchallenged in the shadows. She thought of her first day at ICE, how certain she'd been about right and wrong, law and justice. Now she understood that true justice required more than enforcing laws. It required the courage to question them, the wisdom to change them, and the compassion to see the humanity they affected. Outside, Los Angeles continued its eternal cycle of light and shadow, but something fundamental had shifted. In offices and hospitals, in government buildings and corporate towers, people were beginning to look more closely at the shadows, to question what they had accepted, to recognize the dignity of those who had been invisible. Sarah Rodriguez, no longer an ICE agent but something more important, finally slept, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities for change. But for the first time since that morning, when she saw her mother in Tech Vision's hallway, she was certain she was on the right side of history. The shadows were still there, but they no longer held the same power. Light was getting in one truth at a time, one story at a time, one change at a time. And that light, like justice itself, could not be unseen once revealed. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!